fog that rolled across the Norman fields that morning felt almost alive, curling around the boots of Canadian infantrymen as they moved forward in disciplined silence. Above them, the muted growl of engines pushed through the haze. It was June 1944, and although the thunder of D-Day had passed, the real war for France was only beginning. Among the armored columns and rifle companies tightening their grip on the occupied countryside, one man's presence shaped the battlefield more than any booming artillery barrage. He was not towering. He didn't bark commands. He didn't slam his fist on tables or demand that his officers fear him. He was Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, and to the Germans, he would soon become a shadow that never slept. Simonds rode inside a simple staff car, the window cracked open as he listened to the distant rhythm of gunfire. He held a map on his lap, marked with quick pencil strokes and carefully drawn arrows. His staff knew better than to disturb him while he thought. He had the unusual ability to see a battlefield not as a chaotic mess, but as a giant machine, with gears that could be arranged and shaped into predictable patterns. He didn't waste words. He didn't raise his voice. Yet every man around him leaned in when he spoke, because his orders always carried the weight of inevitability. A young captain sat beside him, flipping through dispatches. "German armored reserves seem to be repositioning again, sir. They're digging in at every crossroads." Simonds barely nodded. "Good. Let them dig. The deeper they settle, the harder the shock." The captain hesitated, unsure whether he was meant to respond. But Simonds' face was unreadable. He had the expression of a man studying an equation rather than planning a battle. That calmness, almost eerie in its consistency, unsettled even his allies at first, but for the Germans, it would become something far more intimidating. Before the war, no one would have predicted he would earn such a reputation. Born in Kingston, Ontario, raised by strict but disciplined parents, Simonds had learned early that control came not from loudness, but from clarity. He grew into a man who measured every breath, every step, every decision. At the Royal Military College, he wasn't the strongest or the most charismatic, but he outworked everyone. When other cadets boasted or gambled or stumbled back from nights of celebration, Simonds sat in the corner of the barracks reading about historic battles or practicing calculations for artillery trajectories. During training exercises, instructors noticed something unusual about him. He could look at a landscape, a forest line, or a stretch of open ground, and instantly imagine how an enemy might move through it. He walked the terrain with an engineer's precision, studying elevation, angles, drainage lines, and visibility. While others memorized doctrine, Simonds absorbed the essence of warfare itself. Years later, in Italy, his talent blossomed. Canadian troops advancing through the peninsula often found themselves locked in brutal, grinding battles against entrenched German positions. The fighting was slow, costly, and made worse by the mountainous terrain. But Simonds saw things differently. He broke through lines that others thought unbreakable by timing artillery barrages with clockwork accuracy and launching attacks that seemed impossible. Soldiers began to whisper about his unusual predictability. When Simonds made a plan, the enemy collapsed exactly when he said they would. One evening, after a successful assault near Ortona, a young sergeant approached an officer and asked, "Who planned that one?" The timing was perfect. It felt like the Germans were reacting to ghosts. The officer shrugged. "Simonds. It's always Simonds." Back in Normandy, that reputation followed him like a quiet drumbeat. The Germans, too, were learning his name. Intelligence reports landed on Panzer Division desks describing a Canadian commander whose maneuvers never aligned with the textbook tactics the Wehrmacht had grown accustomed to reading. Simonds refused to fight fair. He refused to let the enemy adapt. He built deception plans into every operation, sending dummy radio signals, shifting artillery units at night, and using smoke barrages so thick they smothered entire villages. In a small farmhouse that German officers had converted into a command post, Colonel Dieter Schultz examined a map of Allied positions. His radio operator delivered a new report captured from a French informant. "The Canadians have moved their artillery again, Herr Oberst. No clear pattern." "No pattern," Schultz muttered. "There is always a pattern, unless the man in charge prefers to make his own." Another officer stepped forward. "We believe the sector is under the command of General Simonds." Schultz's jaw tightened. "Then expect something violent, and expect it when you feel most secure." The colonel wasn't wrong. Simonds understood the Germans in a way that unsettled even them. He studied their habits, doctrines, tendencies. He read their mistakes as if they were open books. While many Allied commanders tried to predict German reactions, Simonds designed his operations to shape those reactions, pushing panzer commanders into precisely the traps he wanted them to fall into. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the ruins of a stone church, Simonds met with his armored officers to plan the next phase of the advance. The room was cold, lit by a single lantern hung from a shattered rafter. Outside, the distant clatter of machine gun fire echoed between the hedgerows. "Gentlemen," he began, standing at the head of a scarred table, "the Germans believe we will commit our armor where the terrain is most open. They expect a conventional attack. We will give them the opposite." A major frowned. "Sir, if we push tanks through the orchards at night, we risk breakdowns. The terrain is uneven." Simonds looked at him, but offered no irritation, only calm certainty. "The terrain will hinder them more than it hinders us. They rely on mobility. We rely on precision. That is the difference." Another officer spoke hesitantly. "The men say the Germans have begun calling you the silent hammer, sir. They say you strike without warning." Simon's expression barely changed. "Names are irrelevant. The results are what matter." But even as he dismissed it, the officers understood the truth. The Germans feared him precisely because he did not behave like the aggressive American generals who charged forward with overwhelming firepower. Nor did he resemble the British commanders who favored deliberate, heavy preparations. Simonds operated in the space between, blending patience with sudden, shocking violence. To the Germans, he was unpredictable in the most dangerous way. He adapted faster than they did. In the days that followed, his plan unfolded with terrifying efficiency. At dusk, Canadian infantry slipped into the hedgerows. Heavy guns opened fire at coordinated intervals, staggered just enough to confuse German spotters. Then, when the Germans shifted to reinforce what they believed was the main thrust, Simonds released a wave of armor through the orchards, exactly as predicted. The ground shook as Shermans rolled forward under the cover of rising smoke. German lines buckled. Officers scrambled to relocate their panzers. But by then it was too late. The trap had already snapped shut. Captured German soldiers spoke in shaken tones about the attack. One, exhausted and covered in dirt, told an interpreter, "Your general fights like a mathematician. Every move we make, he already knows. It is like he sees us from above." When Simonds received the report, he simply folded the paper and placed it on his desk. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He only prepared the next phase. For him, fear was never the goal. Victory was. As night settled across Normandy, Simonds stood alone outside his headquarters tent, watching tracer fire arc faintly across the horizon. The wind carried the smell of smoke and churned soil. Behind him, officers hurried from one table to another, charting the next day's movements. But Simonds remained still, hands behind his back, as if listening to the battlefield breathe. "Sir?" The captain from earlier approached cautiously. "Orders for the morning?" Simonds turned slightly. "At dawn, we move again." The captain nodded, sensing the weight beneath those simple words. "And the Germans, sir?" Simonds looked back toward the front. "They'll know. And they'll be ready, but not ready enough." He stepped back inside the tent, closing the flap behind him. The next phase of the war was about to begin, and with every mile the Canadians advanced, German officers grew more certain of one thing. The quiet man from Canada was not just another Allied commander. He was becoming their greatest threat. The rain had not stopped for 2 days, yet the Canadian positions along the front did not rest. Mud sucked at boots, fog drifted in thick layers through the hedgerows, and the distant rumble of German artillery rolled across the soaked countryside like thunder trapped inside a drum. It was late summer 1944, and the Allied advance had reached a point where momentum mattered more than comfort, more than sleep, more than the misery seeping into every seam of a soldier's uniform. In the middle of this harsh rhythm stood Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, planning the operations that would soon break German confidence far more brutally than any American charge or British bombardment. He stood beneath a canvas awning near a battered farmhouse that served as a temporary command post. Rain dripped steadily from the edges of the canvas, tapping into puddles with a patient, almost taunting rhythm. Officers crowded around a folding table where maps were spread under lantern light, weighed down with stones to protect them from the wind. The stakes were enormous. The Germans were refusing to break, clinging to every forest, village, and ridge as if surrendering even a field would unravel the entire Eastern Front. Simonds surveyed the room without speaking for several seconds. His eyes traced the arcs of the artillery placements, the known positions of German panzer divisions, the supply routes, and the rolling terrain that offered both obstacles and opportunities. He had a unique ability to look at the chaos of shifting battle reports and see only patterns. Finally, he spoke. "Operation Totalize will begin in 72 hours. The officers straightened. Even those who had served with him for months felt a flicker of unease whenever he announced a new plan. Simonds' operations were rarely typical and never gentle. He understood that the Germans expected predictable Allied methods: long artillery barrages, slow infantry advances, cautious armor pushes. But Simonds had grown tired of fighting the enemy on their terms. He intended to force them to react, to bend, to stumble, and then to break. His voice remained calm as he pointed to the map. "We attack at night. The Germans believe we cannot coordinate armor and infantry in darkness. They are mistaken." Several senior officers exchanged wary glances. Night attacks on such a scale were dangerous, technically demanding, and often catastrophic. But Simonds' calm confidence muted all objections before they formed. "Sir," a major whispered, "moving tanks at night through these villages, with this terrain, could cause delays. The men won't be able to see." Simonds folded his hands behind his back. "They won't need to see. They will follow the armored personnel carriers." "Carriers?" an officer echoed, puzzled. Simonds nodded. "Yes, the kangaroos." The The room fell into a brief silence as the officers absorbed the implications. The kangaroos were a new invention born out of Simonds' own relentless innovation, armored troop carriers made from stripped-down tanks. Infantry would no longer run across open fields under machine gun fire. They would ride forward behind steel plating, protected, efficient, and ready to strike at the heart of German positions. A colonel leaned forward, speaking softly. "It's unconventional." "War rewards the unconventional," Simonds replied, "especially when the enemy expects the familiar." When the planning session ended, officers dispersed into the wet night, whispering among themselves about the audacity of what he proposed. Only Simonds remained, staring at the rain-shrouded horizon. He knew the Germans had no answer for this combination. Fast-moving armor at night, shielded infantry, and a crushing air bombardment timed with mathematical precision. It was a recipe designed to overwhelm even the most experienced panzer commanders. Across the battlefield, in a German field headquarters hidden inside a grove of trees, Major General Kurt Meyer studied his own map. His fingers traced the line marking the Canadian sector. He had fought on the Eastern Front, survived the brutal winter battles against the Red Army, and earned a reputation for ferocity. But in Normandy, he was facing something different. A junior officer handed him a report. "Another Allied general identified in intercepted transmissions, Herr General. Simonds, the Canadian Second Corps." Meyer took the paper silently. "Simonds again." He ran a thumb along his jawline. "He does not attack the way the British do, or the Americans. He strikes where others hesitate." The junior officer frowned. "Do you think he will risk a full armored assault at night?" Meyer shook his head slowly. "No one does that. It is madness." But as night swallowed the land a few days later, Meyer's assumption shattered. At exactly 2300 hours, the sky ignited. Bombers roared overhead, releasing waves of explosives that turned the German front line into a storm of flames and soil. The ground trembled violently, shaking the nerves of even the veterans crouched in the trenches. The bombardment rolled in perfect intervals, creating pathways in the German defenses that were almost surgical. Then, out of the darkness, the unmistakable growl of engines whooped like an approaching avalanche. Tanks and kangaroo carriers surged forward in tight formation, their silhouettes barely visible through the smoke. A young German soldier clutched his rifle to his chest, eyes wide. "They're coming at night? Are they insane?" His sergeant pulled him down as machine gun fire erupted. "These aren't Americans. These are Canadians. Stay low." The Canadians swept through the first line of defenses with brutal efficiency. Inside the kangaroos, infantrymen felt the rumble of nearby explosions against the steel hulls, but knew they were safer than any soldiers who had tried to charge across open ground earlier in the war. When the carriers reached their dismount points, the rear hatches dropped, and the men poured out into the shattered villages like a tidal surge. Simonds had timed everything perfectly. German officers, still recovering from the shock of the bombardment, scrambled to reposition their panzers, but the night made communication chaotic. The precision they relied on fractured. By morning, Canadian forces had captured ground in hours that normally required days of attrition. The German defensive doctrine had been shredded, and the Canadians were nowhere near finished. Operation Tractable followed just days later. And with it came another shock. The Germans believed the Canadians would be drained, disorganized, or slow after their night assault. Instead, Simonds launched a second offensive so quickly that panzer commanders cursed in disbelief. Dust clouds rose across the fields as tanks and carriers moved again, synchronized like a machine. A captured German officer later described the sensation. "We had no time to breathe. They attacked us with machines, then attacked us before the machines cooled. No rest, no predictability." In another bunker, far behind the lines, a German intelligence officer slammed his fist on the table. "This General, Simonds, he is not stopping. It is as if he fights to a schedule only he knows." Meanwhile, Simonds studied aerial reconnaissance photographs with the same calm focus as always. He rarely visited the front during assaults. He preferred the overview, the complete moving picture. His officers admired him for that clarity. They trusted him in a way that bordered on reverence. One evening after Tractable's first breakthrough, he met with a group of exhausted infantrymen. Their uniforms were dark with sweat and mud. One soldier saluted weakly. "Sir, we thought you'd give us at least a day to rest before sending us again." Simons's voice was soft. "The Germans will expect us to rest. That is why you must move." The soldier blinked in confusion, then nodded. Even bone-tired, he understood. The Germans had been rocked. To let them recover would give them back the one thing they had always relied on: time. Before dawn, the Canadians moved again. The German perspective grew more grim by the hour. Reports flooded headquarters describing Canadian units appearing in places they shouldn't have been able to reach so quickly, overwhelming positions that were thought secure, and using kangaroo carriers in ways that German anti-tank crews struggled to counter. One officer wrote bitterly in his diary, "The Canadians attack like iron ghosts. Their general must never sleep." By mid-August, the German 7th Army was collapsing toward the Falaise pocket, and Simonds' operations were central to the tightening noose. Once the pocket closed, thousands of German troops were captured or killed. The survivors spoke of the Canadian Blitz with a mix of frustration and dread. They had been caught in a series of operations that were too inventive, too fast, and too relentless to counter. When the smoke settled, Simonds visited the front-line positions. He walked quietly among the men, offering brief words and nods of acknowledgement. There were no speeches, no triumphant gestures. He didn't need them. His soldiers understood that they had executed something extraordinary. They had shattered German confidence with precision and discipline, guided by a commander who saw war not as chaos, but as a series of solvable problems. As dusk settled on the battered countryside, Simonds stood alone on a ridgeline overlooking the valley, where the final German forces had attempted to escape. Columns of smoke curled lazily upward, softening into the evening sky. Behind him, officers waited for instructions. "What now, sir?" one asked. Simonds took in the view for a long moment. "Now," he said, "we prepare for what comes next. The enemy is wounded. That is when they are most dangerous." He turned away, heading back toward headquarters as the last traces of daylight faded. The Maple Leaf Blitz had stunned the Germans, but the war was far from over. And as Canadian troops readied themselves for new battles, German officers whispered a truth they had not dared speak aloud before. This Canadian general fought differently, and there was no telling what he would do next. The autumn wind carried a sharp bite as it swept across the scarred fields of northern France. What had once been quiet farmland was now a churned wasteland of wrecked armor, splintered timber, and craters filled with cold rainwater. The German retreat was in full motion, but even as their forces fell back toward the fortified Scheldt and the Low Countries, a deeper fear stalked them. It moved through their bunkers at night, whispered through their command posts, and carried a single name with it: Simonds. Inside a reinforced bunker carved into the side of a wooded ridge, a group of German officers huddled over a lantern-lit table. The bunker smelled of damp earth and diesel fumes. Wooden beams groaned softly under the weight of the hillside. Rain hammered the ground above like distant gunfire. Major Eric Wolf, a grizzled veteran with a scar across his cheek, tapped the end of his pencil against a map. The lines of the Allied advance tightened around their sector. "He is coming again," Wolf murmured. A lieutenant swallowed hard. "Simonds?" Wolf nodded. Who else moved so quickly after 2 major operations? The Americans take days to reorganize. The British wait for perfect conditions. But the Canadians, under this man... He shook his head, unable to finish the sentence. Even as the officers spoke in anxious tones, Canadian forces under Lieutenant General Guy Simonds were preparing for the next phase of the campaign. The battles around the Scheldt estuary would be some of the muddiest, most miserable, and most tactically complicated operations of the entire war. Flooded polders, narrow causeways, and stubborn German defenses made the region a nightmare for any attacking force. Yet if the Allies wanted the port of Antwerp open, they needed the Scheldt cleared. It was another problem that required intellect, discipline, and innovation, qualities Simonds cultivated like no other commander on the front. At his headquarters, a cramped brick building that shook with every nearby artillery blast, Simonds stood before a chalkboard crowded with timelines and formations. His staff worked quietly around him, scribbling notes and cross-checking reports. The only sound was the occasional rumble of distant guns and the scratching of chalk as Simonds added another calculated line. An officer approached and cleared his throat. "Sir, the men are exhausted. The terrain ahead is worse than anything we've faced. They're asking if we're waiting for reinforcements." Simonds turned his head just enough to acknowledge him. "We will not wait," he said. "The Germans will use every hour we give them to strengthen their defenses. We move while they're disoriented." "Sir," the officer said quietly, "some of them are saying the enemy fears you more than they fear the American generals." Simonds paused, lowering the chalk. His gaze softened only slightly. "Fear is not the objective. Efficiency is. The quicker we end this, the fewer men we lose." The officer nodded, but the words lingered. Even Simonds couldn't deny what had become increasingly obvious. The Germans were watching him with a kind of wary respect usually reserved for the most aggressive Allied commanders. But what unsettled them most was that Simonds didn't fit that mold. He wasn't flashy. He didn't shout. He didn't crave the spotlight. He simply produced results, again and again, at a pace the Germans could not match. In the German bunker, Lieutenant Rudiger laid down a battered field report. "Our intelligence notes say the Canadians reorganized again in record time. They've already pushed reconnaissance units toward the causeways." Wolf's jaw tightened. "They move like a machine. And this general of theirs, he adapts faster than any Allied commander I've seen. If he decides to break the Scheldt defenses, he will." Another officer, Captain Drexler, rubbed his temples. "I read a captured letter from a British soldier. He called Simonds a surgeon, surrounded by men who swing sledgehammers." The others exchanged grave looks. Even their enemies recognized that Simonds' approach was unnervingly precise. On the ground, Canadian soldiers pushed through flooded fields and deep mud, their uniforms soaked, their boots heavy with water. The Holland wind sliced across their faces Like shards of glass, many wondered how their exhausted bodies could keep advancing. Yet Simonds' plans gave them direction. His timing gave them confidence, and his results gave them proof that he understood this brutal landscape better than any general had a right to. He walked the line personally whenever possible, moving from unit to unit with his hands clasped behind him, rain soaking through his service cap. Soldiers straightened instinctively when he approached. Simonds rarely offered more than a few concise words, but the men hung on each one. He didn't speak with charisma. He spoke with clarity. A young corporal stepped forward as Simonds inspected a map board positioned on a muddy jeep's hood. "Sir, permission to ask a question?" Simonds nodded. "Are the Germans really afraid of us? Of you?" "The prisoners are saying things." Simonds looked at him with quiet sincerity. "They are afraid of momentum. We deny them time. That is what frightens them." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough. In the German bunker, the officers leaned over a field telephone as a frantic voice crackled through. "The Canadians are advancing again. They're using artillery to screen their movement across the embankments. We can't get clean shots." Wolf slammed the phone down. "Simonds, it must be. Only he coordinates barrages like that." Captain Drexler clenched his fists. "How does he do it? He strikes before we can react. He moves before we can breathe." Wolf exhaled slowly. "Because he understands us. That is what makes him dangerous." As the battle for the Scheldt intensified, Canadian forces waged a grinding, brutal campaign across the flooded lowlands. The Germans fought fiercely, refusing to yield the narrow causeways and elevated positions that anchored their defense. Yet Simonds adapted with relentless ingenuity. He directed artillery to fire smoke screens across the waterways, blinding German observers. He reorganized units mid-operation, shifting battalions from one axis to another with astonishing speed. He created deception maneuvers that stretched German nerves to a breaking point. One German officer, interrogated after his capture, summarized the fear. "Your general plans like a machine. He anticipates every counterattack, every fallback, every movement. We wait for an opening, but he leaves none." Even as the Scheldt campaign dragged on in mud and misery, Simonds' control never wavered. His stoic presence became a source of stability for his men and a source of dread for his enemies. During a strategic briefing near the town of Vohenstrecht, Simonds listened as one of his artillery officers explained the worsening supply shortages. Ammunition needed to be rationed. Vehicles were breaking down in the mud. Men were reaching the limits of physical endurance. Simonds examined the map with the same calm concentration he had shown since Normandy. "We commit what we must," he said. "The Germans are stretched thin. If we push now, they will not hold." "But sir," the officer said, "our men are suffering." Simonds paused. "So are theirs, but ours know what victory requires." He returned his gaze to the map, but every officer in the room understood the deeper message. They would push, they would endure, and they would break the German defense because their general believed it could be broken. In the German bunker, the situation worsened by the hour. Shells crashed against their fortifications with relentless rhythm. The radio line sputtered with panic. Drexler looked at Wolf. "Do you think he will stop, even when the mud is swallowing the vehicles?" Wolf shook his head. "Simonds doesn't stop. He calculates. And right now he knows we're out of options." Outside, the roar of Canadian artillery grew louder, the explosions vibrating through the earth and into the bones of every soldier sheltering below. The bunker lights flickered as dust drifted from the ceiling. Wolf closed his eyes briefly. When this war is over, mark my words, they will study him. Not because he shouts or charges blindly, but because he thinks, and he makes us react, not the other way around. In the final days of the Scheldt campaign, German morale cracked. Defensive lines that had held for weeks dissolved under the pressure of coordinated attacks that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The Canadians secured key positions, opened the routes toward Antwerp, and carved another chapter into their wartime legacy. Simonds visited the front again as the guns fell silent. The cold wind whipped at his coat as he looked across the flooded fields. He offered no triumphant gesture, no speech. He simply observed the battlefield with quiet reflection. A colonel approached. "Sir, reports say the Germans have begun retreating inland. Many surrendered. Some mentioned you by name." Simonds nodded. "Then they understand the cost of resistance." The colonel hesitated. "They believe you cannot be stopped." Simonds stared out at the distant horizon. "Every commander can be stopped, but not today." He turned and walked back toward his headquarters, leaving behind a landscape that had been shaped not by luck or brute force, but by relentless focus, innovation, and discipline. And as German survivors withdrew, many whispered the same uneasy truth. It wasn't the size of the Canadian army that terrified them. It was the mind directing it.